Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen, retired troopers Casey, Alfano, and Cruz are American heroes, always will be. Nobody, no matter what your profession, should expect to go to work and tolerate this. Nobody. Whether you're in the military or you're a police officer, that is not okay. The three of them deserve our reverence and our respect and our support as long as they live. But that reverence comes with a word of caution for the trial jurors. Because we revere them as we should, it doesn't mean that everything Trooper Casey said is right. It doesn't mean that everything he told you about from the witness stand can be accurate. It just doesn't. It's not how things work. He told you he's 100% certain, as certain as he can be about anything, that it was the person in the back seat behind the driver that shot him, and that was Ramon Bueno. But a gut instinct isn't proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It can't be quantified. It can't be measured. It's not like Mr. Bedow's testimony, and we'll get to that later. It's that gut instinct doesn't carry the day. I told you in my opening statement that there's a hole in the evidence. And then I told you that Trooper Casey picked someone else out of a lineup. You know that he picked position number 6 for, didn't pick it, but stopped on it for a while and then moved over to position number 1 and wrote shooter by that picture. And I also told you that's where it begins. It's not where it ends. It's not just that. That may mean nothing. It doesn't matter if Ramon Bueno was in the back seat driver's side of that car. It doesn't matter if he rambled, I think Detective Butcher called it freestyle at the interrogation. It doesn't matter if his DNA and laptop are found in the back seat of the car. It doesn't matter if and when he was at the Cold Air Cafe. It just doesn't. It doesn't matter that Pisces were offered up for some form of help. It doesn't matter if he provided a fake name or that he was walking along the train tracks with Danny Vargas. It doesn't matter if he says, "I'm fucked," when they're talking about what if your DNA's in the car. And again, it doesn't matter if Trooper Casey is as certain as he can be of anything that Ramon was the shooter. Those are red herrings. They're not purposeful. They're just part of the evidentiary chain in this case. But they divert your attention from the real issue. Who shot Trooper Casey? Retired Trooper Casey. Let's turn to the evidence. And as I do this, keep in your minds the foreboding words of Danny Vargas. "I hate cops." No one else said that. That was Danny Vargas. Just keep that in the back of your minds as you listen to us this morning and this afternoon, and as you contemplate and ponder the evidence and deliberate later. I hate cops. Let's talk about Detective Gunnels. I call these lesser witnesses not because they're not important or they're lesser people. They didn't provide a lot. They didn't provide testimony that can advance your deliberations when you have to decide what happened. It almost seems that he could have responded to a different crime scene. He talked about a trooper firing with a long gun or a rifle at a car going southbound on the frontage road to the east of the Knights Inn. He testified that a trooper may have even fired a long gun or a rifle from one of the DPS vehicles. That just didn't happen. But what it does, and he also talked about tunnel vision, but what his testimony does for you and does for all of us, it gives us a lesson how hard chaos and tragedy and gunfire is to process, no matter how well you're trained. And that man, I think, had been on the force for 20 years. I don't recall the number. You can rely on your collective memories. It seemed like he responded to a different crime scene. And that's okay. But that shows the frailty and the vagaries of eyewitness testimony and our, as human beings, ability to recall things that we see and perceive when it's chaotic and stressful and dangerous. That applies to Trooper Casey too. It applies to all of us, but it applies to all of the witnesses who stumbled upon that scene or who were there when this stuff happened. William Sunderland, he's another example. This guy is a fly on the wall. The only dog, to use Ms. Dahl's quote, that he had in the fight was he didn't want to get shot, of course, but he's on a balcony. He's south of where this happened. I think he has his dog out and he hears a shot or something, and so he's on the balcony just looking northbound, observing this as it happens. What's he telling you? Again, it shows or underscores the problem with human perception and memory and being able to recall what we see, whether we see it right here or from a distance. He was a distance away. He told you all three troopers were firing. That's not consistent with the evidence, is it? All three. And the gunfire, I recall him saying, rely on your collective memories and notes, all the shots are going in and out of the back window. And that back window was shot quite a bit, at least by law enforcement. And eventually the officer on the passenger side of the Sable went down. And that would be Trooper Casey. That's really not how the heroes who were there recall what happened. They weren't shooting in and out of the back window with a Sable. And again, this just underscores for you, the trial jurors, who have to decide what really happened and if the case is proven beyond a reasonable doubt or not. The problem with that perception, when people are under fire, when things are startling us, and we're drawn into something that we weren't expecting. That's Mr. Sunderland. Again, fly on the wall, just out, smoking or whatever with his dog. Sergeant Latham, interesting. He didn't talk about much that really moves the needle in your deliberations, but what he did say that ties in perhaps with what Officer Gummels or Detective Gummels recalls was he shouldered a rifle, a long gun. He shows up after the shooting. Everything had kind of, well, the shooting had stopped. Things hadn't settled down. They probably never do. And so if you look at that and you compare that to what Detective Gummels said about a trooper with a long gun either shooting at a southbound car or shooting from a stationary or mobile DPS vehicle, you start to see how our perception fails us, perhaps. Detective Wallen, he didn't have much. There are important things. Trooper Casey was clearly injured, struggling to breathe, had stuff in his mouth, and I think maybe he said he spoke a little bit. Special Agent Champion, he's a special agent now. I call him the phone guy because he's the phone guy. He didn't add much, but you know, we're talking about 2014, not Alexander Graham Bell's infancy. Technology was advanced in 2014. Cellbrite, the technology law enforcement uses to get data from phones, that stuff is up and running, and it was very robust, a great way to solve problems. But this case just wasn't one that cell phone data pinging off the towers really lent anything to the case. Dr. Patel, what a hero. Oh, he is great at what he does. He saves lives for a living, and he does it each and every day. The interesting thing about Dr. Patel and what he didn't offer you is that trajectory that Ms. Dahl talked about of that bullet. There's no downward to upward, upward to downward, left to right, right to left, straight on. That's information and evidence or testimony that you didn't hear. You don't know the direction of that trajectory when it struck Trooper Casey in the face. And I'll get back to that later. Trooper Roadcap. Yeah, I think all he told us or told you was that if Lori Richardson drove that car all the way around the Knight's Inn, she couldn't have gone back around again because it was blocked with traffic, and she had to have left through the northernmost exit of the Knight's Inn. That's about it. Detective Bishel, and I'll get to this in a minute too, talked about red paint transfer onto one of her tires. Look at those exhibits you have. I don't have the exhibit number in my mind. There's a broken red curb and there's red paint transferred to her tire. Not sure how slow she was going when she exited. She told you, and we'll talk about her later too, that she had slowed down to exit. It doesn't seem like it. But take a look at that during your deliberations. Detective Toby Myers, she was assigned to investigate the scene. Not, it is as one would expect. The shell casings were kind of centrally located where the troopers were. Doesn't really do much to help you determine who shot Trooper Casey. Detective Bishel again talked about the red paint transfer. He processed the car. The car was shot up, consistent with the testimony you heard. Officer Wetzel, he's interesting. The SWAT guy, he goes to 4251 West Vista. Mr. Bueno was outside, wasn't hiding. Danny Vargas inside, hiding. He said the arrest was peaceful. Mr. Bueno was compliant, followed all orders, did as he was told. Yet he ends up, according to his words from the video you have of his free talk or his freestyle talk with Detective Butcher, head stomped, knee stomped, shoulder injured, had to go to the hospital. He didn't go to the hospital to gather his thoughts. He went to the hospital to seek medical attention. 10 minutes after Ramon Bueno was arrested, Danny Vargas was arrested. He was in the house. Detective Rasmussen, he was a night detective. He collected the shirt and the 4 unspent shell casings that matched the spent shell casing in the back of Lori Richardson's car. No useful biological evidence came from those shell casings, the unspent ones or the spent one. Not necessarily helpful in directing you to who did what. Mr. Beda, the firearms examiner, if he's anything, he's bright. He knows his stuff. But what he told you doesn't necessarily advance your job. There's evidence beyond that that you have to consider. But there was an issue conflated, and it's interesting. It came up a couple of times during the trial. The question of, do we all perceive sound the same way? We don't. Can a gunshot sound like a whooshing sound or whoosh to somebody and not someone else? It can. But at close proximity, a gunshot damages hearing. I'm not saying permanently. Trooper Cruz told you, he's outside of the car with his flashlight against the window. His left ear was impaired for a while. Lori Richardson's wasn't. She didn't even hear it. Kendra Griffey, she was, I think, the former wedding photographer who found an awesome new career as a criminalist in the forensic imaging unit. She went to the Cold Air Internet Cafe as ordered or asked, gets the videotape from that ornery assistant manager, and in response to one of your many awesome questions, someone said, how do you know if the timestamp's off 5 or 6 hours that the day is right? She doesn't. She said she doesn't. She can't tell. She doesn't know. There's no way to track that backward. Mr. Bueno, it's him. He arrives at the Cold Air Internet Cafe on a bicycle. And I think the last we see in that footage, he's walking away. But then fast forward to West Vista. By that backpack, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, there's a little BMX bicycle. Sarah Zuckerbrow, DNA analyst. The laptop was in the back of the Sable. His DNA's on it. They open it up, and there's a picture of him. That doesn't help you solve who shot whom, or who shot Trooper Casey. But remember, Danny Vargas's foreboding words, I hate cops. Mr. Kreidel, the document examiner. Doesn't really help you in your task. Larry Martinez, he's the engineer, the conductor at the railroad yard. He sees a guy running. He then sees 2 people. He sees a car go by. I believe he says it was the Sable. And those 2 guys appear as though they're hiding from the Sable. These two individuals walk in front of the train. I think he said one had a bag, kind of morphed into a backpack, relying on your collective memories. It was a backpack or a bag. Didn't have it when they went in front of the locomotive, and their hands were empty. There was no video expert to come in here and enhance that video and show you a firearm in either one of those men's hands, let alone Ramon Bueno. I mean, look at it, you should. Take a close look, you should. There's no firearm in that footage. No one puts a gun in Ramon Bueno's hands. He said they seemed concerned because of the car that was going by, but were rather lighthearted. Clint Davis, retired detective Clint Davis, he's a gang expert. He's an expert on the American Mexican Mafia and other criminal street gangs. He wants you to believe that the only people that use the word snitch are people that are involved in that organization. That word is as old as dirt. People of all walks of life, races, creeds, colors, use the word snitch. It is not confined to suspected members of the American Mexican Mafia. Ms. Dahl mentioned in her opening, and just again in her closing, her first part of her closing, that Bueno knew that shooting Casey was the ultimate in his world. What world? Where's the motive for that? And let's look at that instruction. Ms. Dahl drew your attention to it. Let's look at motive. It's in her honors instructions of law that govern what you do. The state need not prove motive. Absolutely need not prove motive. But you may consider motive or lack of motive in reaching your verdict. How does Clint Davis's testimony provide you with motive? Let's say he is in a gang. Just shoot somebody because you're in a gang? Shoot him in the face because you're in a gang? That's not motive. That's reaching. That's a bridge too far. It's not a motive for shooting a law enforcement officer in the face. I mean, he does nothing to clear things up. He has no curriculum vitae, no published articles. He's never been peer-reviewed that you learn through his testimony. He didn't need to be crossed. He sat up there with his hands empty saying, this is what I know. And he teaches or lectures to people, kind of like he did here. That's not a motive for Ramon Bueno to shoot Trooper Casey in the face. Talked about some guy named Louis Perez. Louis Perez never took the witness stand. You didn't hear a word from him. You may hear a little more about him, but you never heard from him. And you get your evidence from the witness stand, not from Ms. Dahl and I. We talk about what we think it means or how you should perceive it or how you should grapple with it or deal with it, but we don't provide you evidence. That right there, the witness stand, and the things they show and the things you'll have in the jury room. Clint Davis's testimony doesn't put a gun in Ramon Bueno's hands, nor does it give him the motive to shoot Trooper Casey in the face. Trooper Alfano, another hero. His testimony was really hand in glove with Trooper Cruz. It was a startling situation. They returned fire on the car. They did everything they could to help their brother in Brown. When the car came by, and these are highly trained law enforcement officers, when the Sable comes back a second time, Trooper Cruz said that it slowed. He believes it purposely slowed so it could shoot again. And think about this, and this goes back to the effect of trauma and chaos on a human being without warning. If it slows and goes by, the passenger side of that car has no bullet strikes. And that's not a criticism of Trooper Cruz and Trooper Alfano, but that's how hard these situations are. And if it throws off motor skills, it throws off one's ability to recall and perceive and recount and remember. Trooper Cruz, he won't admit it. He was probably the reason Trooper Casey made it to the hospital with a heartbeat. Too humble to tell you that. He was resistant on the witness stand to take credit for anything. But he did. He's a Marine veteran. He's a veteran of the streets, policing the streets. He saved his life. That's how good he is. And even he couldn't hit that passenger side of that car. Couldn't see in the car. The windows were limo tint. Like looking through this. Put that police light up against it, saw nothing. So he and Trooper Alfano, both their testimony doesn't really help you in your task of figuring out who shot Trooper Casey. Detective Butcher. She's retired now and does something else, but she was a case agent, lead detective. She's not expected to know and remember everything about the case because that's her role. She testified she's recognized in the field of officer-involved shootings. She's good, really good, or was. Testified about the extensive media coverage featuring Danny Vargas and Ramon Bueno. She testified, she spoke with Lori Richardson twice initially, the 9th and the 20th of October 2014. She wasn't forthright. That's a polite way of saying she couldn't be trusted. She lied. She testified, right there, that Lori Richardson was consistent that Ramon Bueno was behind her as a driver. She testified that Lori Richardson didn't waver that Ramon Bueno was seated behind her. She saved that for trial. She took an oath. She looked all of you in the eyes when she testified, and she put Danny Vargas behind her. You saw it. You heard it. That's one of Lori Richardson's many missteps that I'll address in a minute, but she saved it for you. Now it's been 5 years. It's a long time, but her testimony was pretty basic. There wasn't a whole lot she could goof up, but she did. And remember, when Detective Butcher was on the witness stand, I said, can't the man who said, I hate cops, do this? Yeah. Yeah, he could. Doesn't just have to be still, and if he does this, a trooper leaning against the outside of the car won't feel it. I didn't ask her if he could have lunged over and kicked on the door and dove over. I just said, couldn't he have done this? He's a big guy. Car's not that big. Or this. He's seated. Yeah, that's all possible. Again, there's no evidence in front of you about the trajectory of that bullet that struck Trooper Casey in the face. You don't know the direction. Well, we know it was traveling at Trooper Casey. Beyond that, you know nothing, and it struck him. Beyond that, you don't know anything about up to down, down to up, left to right, right to left, nothing. And because Trooper Casey isn't necessarily he's not towering over the car, his stature's a little lower, the gun need not have been outside of that car to strike him in the face. His head isn't above the roof of that car. Detective Butcher told you she interviewed Ramon Bueno, right over here. He hemmed and hawed. That doesn't mean he shot Trooper Casey. She testified that if Lori Richardson said, in response to a question from me, if Lori testified she was not in custody during her free talk, is that correct? Nope. She was in the Estrella jail. She had to be transported to and from. If Lori Richardson testified that she didn't know Danny Vargas prior to October 8th of 2014, is that true? Is that consistent? Nope. If Lori Richardson testified that Danny Vargas didn't call her for a ride that morning, October 8th of 2014, is that true? Nope, not true. If Lori Richardson testified right there from that witness stand that she could only pick Danny Vargas out of a lineup because of the media, is that inconsistent? Yep, inconsistent, not true. If Lori Richardson testified she was never in a car with Danny Vargas prior to October 8th of 2014, is that inconsistent or untrue? Yep. Yep. It's another lie. She knew him, and she lied to you about it. If Lori Richardson testified that I asked her, Detective Butcher, if she glanced backward Is that inconsistent? Yeah, at least with a statement or two. If Lori Richardson testified from that witness stand that she could pick Ramon Bueno out of a photo lineup independent of the news exposure, is that true, Detective Butcher? Nope, that's a lie too. If Lori Richardson said, I've never done meth, that's not true either. I didn't do meth the day of this incident. My mind was clear. That's not true. She told Detective Butcher 30 to 40 minutes before the traffic stop, she did meth. She told you, not enough to get behind, we'll talk about that in a minute. She'd been up for 3 days. Detective Butcher told you that that kind of lifestyle, based on Detective Butcher's training and experience, is consistent with meth abuse. I asked Detective Butcher, have you ever heard of anyone, in your experience on the police force, training and experience, heard of anyone developing a tolerance for meth by not using it? Nope. Inconsistent with science and the way things are. Is a whoosh sound consistent with a gunfire, a gunshot? Nope. Is a whoosh sound consistent with the gun perhaps fired within 12 inches or 24 inches of your head? No. If Richardson testified that Danny sat behind her on October 8th of 2014, is that consistent? She sat right there and said, no, that's not consistent. It became consistent when Lori Richardson testified. But until then, it wasn't consistent at all. Detective Butcher testified that Lori Richardson was unwavering in who was behind her and who was in the backseat passenger side. Not anymore. She took her oath, she looked at all of you, she testified in front of all of you, and all that changed. Now it's Danny in the backseat, back driver's side. If Lori Richardson testified that the person behind her was in white, is that consistent? No. Detective Butcher told all of us, told you, that Lori Richardson's assistance, her help, played a part in the charging of Ramon Bueno. That's a problem. And I'll talk about Lori Richardson in a minute, but that's a problem because Detective Butcher and all of law enforcement, they're only as good as the evidence they receive. It's kind of the garbage in, garbage out problem. They have to rely on things they're told. They talked to her 4 times. It was almost different all 4 times. And while she was the first in that car to surrender, it wasn't an honorable deed. She lied through her teeth to Detective Butcher on the 9th of October of 2014. But the police are stuck with it, at least in part. But you're not. You should reject it. On redirect of Detective Butcher, Ms. Dahl asked her a very good question. Is it hard sitting up there and providing testimony in a setting like this? The answer is clearly yes. Everything about this is scary. This is scary. I said, yeah, it is. It's hard. And you all know that Lori Richardson isn't a trained witness. But again, and we'll talk more about her in a minute, her choices were binary. It's one or the other. It can't keep mixing up. It wasn't that difficult. All she had to do was answer simple questions. Who was behind you? Who was behind Vanessa? Who was in the middle? Ms. Dahl had to diagram a car. I mean, not to scale diagram. It's almost, okay, is this a steering wheel? Yeah. Does the gas go in here? Yeah. Okay, here's the back seat. And she still said Danny Vargas was behind her. We'll talk about that in a minute, too. You have to consider Lori Richardson's testimony with caution and great care. A car need not be diagrammed to help someone with these binary choices of front, back, left, right. But it was. It was. So turning to Lori Richardson, again, consider her testimony with caution and great care. She is simply not credible. Nothing that comes out of her mouth is trustworthy. Well, there are a couple of things. It was her car. She drove it. Vanessa was in the front seat. She had a license, registration, and insurance, and the windows were too dark. They're fine in Kansas, but they're not fine here. And she was driving, and she pulled over when Trooper Casey pulled them over. That's probably the extent of anything she has to say that is remotely resembling trustworthiness. She took a plea deal to soften her blow. She was asked, "You're here because you have to be." That was an honest answer. She said yes. But it didn't take her long to run afoul of that cooperation agreement. One of her first statements was, "Truth is truth." That's still puzzling, coming from someone who can't recognize the truth. That's what she said. She took an oath, looked at you, and lied, as she's done with everyone else in this case from time to time, all these years. Don't be offended. She's treating you like she's treated every other audience she's had to discuss what she knows about this case. Here's where she misled you, lied to you, or was inconsistent. She testified that these strangers called her friend Mari for a ride. That's not true. She cleaned that up. Danny called her. She knew Danny. Danny called her phone. Danny had her phone number. They knew one another. She said she never met Danny before. Well, that's not true. He had her phone number. She knew him. He knew her. She said she could only pick Danny out of a lineup because of the media exposure. We talked about that. That's patently false. Who's she covering for? The man who said, "I hate cops"? Who's acting like he was sleeping with his arms stretched out, not tucked by his face? She wasn't in jail during the free talk. That's not true. She could pick Ramon Bueno out of a lineup independent of the news exposure. Not true. Had to show her previous statement. You saw it. We call it impeaching a witness. We had to correct that. Another forced fix. Again, the whole meth thing, didn't do it the day of the crime. Never did meth. Oh, I did enough, but it doesn't get me high. She's one of the few meth addicts or meth users that does meth, but not for the effect it has on you. She developed a tolerance by not using it. She'd been up forever. The whoosh sound, inconsistent with a gunshot. And even on the witness stand, when Ms. Dahl wasn't trying to help her, I'm implying nothing like that, but when Ms. Dahl's going over this, what did we just hear? She has a diagram up of the car where the gas goes and the steering wheel is, and people in the back sit back here and people in the front sit here. She still put Danny Vargas behind her. Ultimately, that's not going to matter, but what matters is her veracity. She told all of you that when the lights went on from Trooper Casey's Tahoe, the people in back got super nervous, got tense, was wrestling around and talking among themselves. I impeached her with a prior statement. She was asked, was anything said back there? Nope, it was quiet. They were still. Who's she covering for? She said she saw a gun or a silhouette of a gun, but never saw a gun, relying on your collective memories. Caution and great care. That's how you evaluate her testimony and how it kind of fits and what you find happens. Trooper James Casey, a hero. Yep. He pulled them over because the women were suspicious. I think the windows were down in the front, 2 windows, and they didn't look at him. So he makes a mental note, I think he said that DPS maybe had they didn't have to stop people for equipment violations or something, but his decision controls. Got behind him, pulled him over. Made sure he could see all the hands. He began gathering identification. He saw no furtive, that's another word for suspicious movements from those in the car. He said the backseat passenger was suspicious because he wouldn't look at him. I guess just like the ladies weren't looking at him. That's the same thing that caused him to pull them over. He testified Ramon wasn't giving him any problems. On redirect, Ms. Dahl asked him if he was law enforcement friendly, and he said no. He gave me a false name. Well, Danny Vargas not only gave him a false name and acted as though he were sleeping, he told him, "I hate cops." Trooper Casey said he kind of countered that by saying, "I hate cops too," but that wasn't a funny exchange. Trooper Casey was probably trying to be disarming and just settle things down, but Danny Vargas wasn't. "I hate cops." But he wasn't suspicious. He's the one in the backseat passenger side who had his arms stretched out. I think that's how, relying on your collective memories, how Trooper Casey described it from the witness stand. Acting like he's sleeping or not well, and Trooper Casey has to bother him, I think he said 4 or 5 times, and that's when he just remarks, "I hate cops." And that's not suspicious. It should be. That's more suspicious than losing sight of someone's hand. But he testified he lost sight of Ramon's hand, his right hand. He was so focused on Ramon. Said he thought a traffic warrant would pop up or something, and he finally got his name. But that's so insignificant. And it's really insignificant as a motive to shoot someone in the face. And the gang tie thing, those allegations, that's insignificant too. He said he wasn't looking, but you saw him, he's 100% certain that Ramon Bueno, the man in the back seat, driver's side of that car, is the one that shot him. And a juror question, one of 60 or 70 from all of you who popped up, it was something like this: if you were not looking up, how do you know Ramon's the shooter? It's his instinct, it's his gut, it's what he thinks, it's what he hopes, it's what he believes. It's not what he saw. It can't be quantified, it can't be measured, it can't be examined. You can't look at it, hold it, touch it, review it. It can't be quantified. Trooper Casey's gut instinct isn't proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not. The tunnel vision, confirmation bias, call it what you want, the chaotic nature of what happened, passage of 5 years in time, you can't quantify it. It doesn't help you. It's something to talk about and think about when you look at everything else. But it's a gut instinct. It's not proof, it's not evidence. It's not hard evidence. And again, based on his stature, he doesn't tower over the roof of that car. And you don't have the trajectory of that bullet that hit him in the face. That's pretty simple and quick. And you don't have to jerk the car around to do that. You can move a lot more than this without moving that car when it's got 5 people in it, so the trooper crews can't feel it. It's a lean. And it's right there. Muzzle flash is visible, everything. The sound, the deafening sound in Trooper Cruz's left ear can all be heard. It's audible. Trooper Casey told you he didn't observe any movement from inside the vehicle or from the suspect. And Ramon Bueno, prior to being shot, didn't see muzzle blast, wasn't looking. He just doesn't know. So, Ramon Bueno can be in the back seat of that car. He can be right where people think he was. He could go to the internet cafe. He could be walking along the train tracks. He could be found on West Vista with a backpack that wasn't where the report said it was. His wallet can be in there with a makeshift medical kit. He wasn't injured. Why would his wallet be in a backpack with a makeshift medical kit? Danny Vargas, who was there, is the one that got shot. So, what do you do with all this? Well, Ms. Dahl's burden, the state's burden, is to prove this to you, that Ramon did all those things beyond a reasonable doubt. And legal scholars have forever tried to grapple with how to define it. Our courts have done a great job, but there's still debate. People still talk about it. Can it be done better? Can it be more simple? Do we need to add more? I think at one point the reasonable doubt instruction was almost a couple of pages long. And now it's pretty succinct and it kind of says it. But to help you in your deliberations, let's consider a number of things. You've chosen a four-person, you're deliberating, you're taking votes, you're setting your schedule, whatever you're doing, but you're all together, as you should be, talking about the evidence. And let's say when you've done that, you find that the evidence has fallen short and is not proven guilty. What do you do? That's easy. Not guilty verdicts across the board. So you do that, upon your careful deliberations, you find it's highly unlikely that Ramon Bueno was the shooter. Well, that's easy too. That's not guilty. Or you find less than likely or probably not or unlikely guilty. Those are all not guilties. Those are easy. Possibly not guilty, maybe not guilty, perhaps not guilty. Simple. Not guilties. Suspected of being guilty? It's, a little more dicey, but that's easy too. That's not guilty. Possibly guilty or probably guilty? What do you do with that? Not guilty. It doesn't meet the burden. The burden that protects all of us. Not just Ramon Bueno, you too, all of us, each and every one of us, every day. What if upon your careful deliberations you find that guilt is likely? What do you do with that? Same. No difference. Not guilty. Doesn't rise to the level of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. What if you find that guilt is highly likely? Nope, not guilty. That's not enough. The state has to prove their case from what they presented there, that Ramon Bueno is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Evidence falls short. And remember, when you deliberate, when Ms. Dahl is done addressing you after lunch, and you deliberate, remember the foreboding words of Danny Vargas and his behavior in the car. I hate cops. Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, we will take our lunch break. We will come back at 1:30. Please remember the admonition applies. The case has not yet been turned over to you for your consideration. You are not to discuss the case. We'll see you back here at 1:30.
All right, adjourned.
Please be seated. We are off the record. See you at 1:30.